welcome to the last Zilog and Moto review of 2019. Or is it? Nah, I'm just playing it. Probably is, unless something very strange happens in the next few days. After this video, I'll begin working on the 2019 Best Worst of the Year, with the goal of having that uploaded either sometime New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, depending on what time zone you're in. But that's all a few days from now. Today, we'll be looking at Choplifter, released in September of 1986 for the Master System. If you think that sounds like an early title, it is, as the Master System was released in the United States that same month. However, this is technically not the first release of Choplifter on the Master System related hardware. Let me back up for a second. Choplifter was originally released in 1982 for the Apple II computer and programmed by a guy named Dan Gorlin. Broderbund Software published that game, and it became a hit, and as such was ported to the Atari 5200 and Atari 8-bit computers, the ColecoVision, the Commodore 64, the VIC-20, along with other versions. That Commodore 64 version is actually my first encounter with the game, having played it with my cousins 30 years ago or so at family gatherings. I remember it being an interesting game, but I also don't remember getting terribly far in it. Well, along with all those ports, Sega saw the promise in the title and licensed the game to create an arcade version, which appeared in 1985. With this, Choplifter became one of the few games ever to originate on home computers or consoles and then appear in the arcades. I can only think of two other games that do this off the top of my head, Guitar Hero 3 and Thunder Force 3. And although I'm sure there are others, it's still rarefied air. But then, things went one step further and we got home console ports of Sega's arcade version of Choplifter. So the game we're looking at today technically went Apple II to the arcade and then back to the Master System. But before this game was released, a year earlier, around the time of the arcade version, Sega released another version of Choplifter for the SG-1000, Sega's first console. That version can technically be played on the Mark III, aka the Japanese version of the Master System, and may be why the actual Master System version, which is vastly improved from that SG-1000 game, was never released in Japan. But if you really have a screw loose, you can get a Master System to Mark III converter and technically play both versions on a Mark III. I have no idea why anyone would want to do that, but hey, us collectors are pretty crazy. Okay, so having said all that, you're probably asking, what the hell is this game that was so popular that it got ported all over the place? Well, I'll tell you. Choplifter is an action game where you're a helicopter pilot whose job it is to fly in enemy territory and rescue captured soldiers, all while fighting off enemy tanks, planes, and submarines, and then fly those captured soldiers back to base before taking off and doing it all again. You gain points for successfully rescuing soldiers and destroying enemy vehicles, but you must rescue enough soldiers to make it to the next level, and if enough die, you will lose a life. As you would expect from an arcade-styled action game, there are three types of levels, and if you pass those three levels, the game will repeat until eventually you lose all your lives during a mission, or fail to save at least 40 of the 64 soldiers in each level. So, did Sega do justice to the arcade port of the original? Or is this game a mess of a launch title and more of a reminder of what could have been? And how does it compare to the NES version? Well, we'll take a look at that and more. But first, let's take a look at the game. Okay, Choplifter with the familiar Master System white box and minimalistic front graphics. I've got to say, as much as I usually complain about these ugly early covers, especially in comparison to what Japan usually got, and I'm going to just superimpose the SG-1000 version cover real quick. Okay, I actually like this, with the searchlights and the barbed wire going all the way across. It still sucks, but, less than, say, pro wrestling. Also, I find it interesting that while this is a port of the arcade version, they still had to put a note on the cover about the game being licensed from Broderbund and Dan Gorlin. Let me zoom in on that real quick. Also below the title, you can see it gets the Mega cartridge branding. So you know that it's 1 megabit or 128 kilobytes. So not a whole lot for Sega to work with here, but hey, at least it's 4 times the size of the SG-1000 version.
The outer cover of the game is in pretty good shape, with a few nicks here and there. A couple, down here, and then uh, one right here. Uh, but those are pretty minor. The hang tab is missing at the top, but at least they did a clean cut to get rid of it. It's not jagged or anything. Other than that, I can't really complain about a 33-year-old game in this condition. The inner cover's in great shape as well, front and back. Speaking of the back, over here on the back, immediately you'll see the standard early Sega box layout with two nice screenshots up here at the top. And I can never zoom in on these properly. I'm definitely going to have to find a better way to do this in Season 2. That showcase the game's first two levels. This is the first level here, and then this is the second level here. When I first saw those screenshots, I was pretty impressed, and I was especially shocked when I learned how early this title was. I figured this must have come a few years in, but no. And on top of that, once I actually played the game, I must say these screenshots don't quite do the game justice. Oh, they're accurate representations of what the game looks like, but it's even better in motion. You'll see shortly. Down below is the standard ads section. Promoting the game, and they actually dialed the cheese down a little bit from what you'd find on other early titles. Granted, it's somewhat stilted, however. Like this section here, starting right there. Pockets of international hostages are trapped all across the world, in the Middle East, in the South Seas. It sounds like someone was writing dialogue for William Shatner, but I digress. Opening the game up, and you're going to see something special. Now, take a look here. First off, check out the label on that cartridge. I'm going to bring that in there. Look how shiny and flat that is. That is in amazing condition. And then, over here to the left, look at that manual. This manual is in tip-top condition. It almost looks like it's never been read. Between the manual and the cartridge, this is easily the Master System game I own that's in the best condition. And I didn't even know it until doing this review. It was just sitting up on the shelf, minding its own business. I very carefully read the manual for this game, and I'll open up here for the video. And as you can see, it's a pretty standard Master System manual. Nothing special here. And to be honest, Choplifter isn't exactly the most complicated game in the world, so there's no need for any in-depth explanations. There are some nice drawings here of the different vehicles. But what's really striking to me is just how good the manual's print looks. This has definitely been well taken care of, and it shows. Alright, so that is a surprisingly nice-looking copy of Choplifter. Now let's take a look at the game and see how many stars we're looking at here. So I guess I'll start things off here by discussing the type of game that Choplifter is. I refer to it as action, and I think that's accurate. However, being that this is a port of the arcade title, I suppose you could give it the arcade label as well, but I think that's usually used for arcade games that don't necessarily fit into a specific type of other genre. Anyway, whether you call it an action title or an arcade title, I definitely would argue that it's not a third category of game, and that's shooter. Even though you spend a lot of time in Choplifter shooting and bombing various enemies, and going left and right across the screen like in a horizontal shooter, the game isn't really about that. Yes, you'll want to clear out enemies to make rescuing groups of soldiers easier, but if you play the game like a shooter and just attempt to blow up everything you come across, the only thing that will happen is that you will die a painful death, sometimes sacrificing the soldiers you're trying to rescue in the process. And let me tell you, there's not a worse feeling in the game than going through all the trouble of rescuing a batch of soldiers, heading back with a full load, and then turning into a giant ball of flame and twisted wreckage before making it back to the home base. You need to be smart when playing Choplifter, because apparently the Hawk Z rescue chopper that you're piloting is made out of military-grade tissue paper, and one shot from any enemy will end your day quickly. Sometimes avoiding enemies on rescue runs is the best way to bring people home safely. And I do mean avoiding them, because you can die via running into enemy vehicles or the ground as well. In prepping for this video, I had one run where I had filled up an entire 16-man group from a prison and was flying back and dove low to get underneath an attacking jet and proceeded to crash straight into the ground. Awesome. But anyway, as frustrating as that might seem, I actually appreciate the fact that you have to really think about your runs, how fast or slow you're going to try to travel, and if you should risk trying to take out an enemy or simply sneak past it, knowing that it's going to still be there when you come back. As mentioned, the Master System of Choplifter is a port of Sega's own arcade version of the game, and I must say it's a pretty outstanding port. However, it is lacking in a few ways, or at least altered. Other than the obvious graphical and sound limitations, there are two major differences between the two versions. First, the gas tank. In the arcade version of Choplifter, a gas tank was added to the chopper for the player to keep up with. The gas tank essentially acts as a game clock, so that players couldn't just sit in an arcade machine and slowly and methodically work their way through a level. They had to keep moving to successfully rescue the required amount of people before crashing out. The NES version by Jalico, which came out in 1986 as well, is actually a good port and retained the gas tank feature. Sega, on the other hand, dumped the gas tank, allowing players to have one less thing to worry about as they navigate the levels, with the caveat being that players would now be required to rescue more soldiers at 40 out of 64 instead of 20 out of 32. I'm actually okay with this change, and it makes sense, and it's one of those changes that makes a console version better, as it recognizes that a console is not the same as an arcade machine. And as such, what makes a good console game is not necessarily the same as what makes a good arcade machine, and vice versa. The other major change from the arcade machine is the level layout. In the arcades, your job was to fly through 4 different levels, starting out in the desert, and then an ocean skirmish, and then into some caves in the mountains, before finally having to rescue people from tall buildings in a city scenario. The NES version again captured this experience, having 4 decidedly different level structures. And I must say, while I don't consider the NES version better than the Master System version for the usual reasons, lacking in graphics and sound, it is a far better port than we saw previously with Rampage and Gauntlet, and Jalico should be commended for that. The Master System version, on the other hand, only showcases the first 3 of those level scenarios. Instead of the city scene at level 4, you get a nighttime version of level 1 in the desert, which is actually a nice throwback to the original Apple II Commodore 64 SG-1000 version. Following that, level 5 is a version of level 2 with blue skies instead of pink, and then level 6, well, I couldn't really tell what the difference was between level 3 and level 6. Maybe the enemy rescue placements are different. But you get the idea. The Master System only has 3 levels that are complete rather than 4. While it would have been nice to have the full complement of levels, Sega only had 128 kilobytes to work with, and something had to be cut, so it makes sense that they would cut a level that only the best players would ever see anyway, and make the other 3 look and sound better. And the game does look and sound great, especially for what was basically a launch title for the console in 1986. I would definitely recommend taking a look at other videos on YouTube that showcase the arcade version and compare them to this, just to see how close Sega was able to get. There are definite small details that aren't as nice, such as how the missiles look that come out of the helicopter, but certain things are straight from the arcade, such as how the jets animate that come swooping in to try and knock you out of the sky. However, the thing that impressed me immediately was the level of parallax scrolling in the game. I simply didn't think such a thing was possible in the Master System, much less not in 1986. And yet, here we are with multiple layers in the foreground and the background that add a ton of depth to the game and create a nice pseudo 3D effect. Also, everything moves smoothly in the game, adding a nice sense of speed and level of stress when trying to avoid projectiles. The one graphical issue I can complain about is that there tends to be a bit of flicker sometimes when picking up soldiers as they walk across the screen to the chopper. It's not a big deal, and it's just a flaw in the Master System when it has to animate a lot of sprites that are on the same line that we saw first way back in the first Zilog and Moto video for pro wrestling. But it is noticeable. From a sound perspective, the music in game is pretty great. It's obviously not arcade quality, but it's upbeat and appropriate for the frenetic action of the game. Also, the music changes up depending on what level you're on, or if you're at the menu screen, so you're not stuck listening to the same track over and over. The sound effects aren't as impressive, but they're fine. Usually you'll be too busy trying not to die or accidentally kill any of the soldiers you're trying to rescue to pay too much attention. I will say that the effects there aren't annoying at least, and don't distract from the action. One last thing I should bring up is the control in the game, and how it relates back to the overall difficulty. Control is relatively simple, with the D-pad controlling where on the screen your helicopter flies. The helicopter will slowly descend as time goes by, so part of the game is constantly having to adjust your elevation. I'm not sure how realistic this is in regarding to flying a real helicopter, but having that sense of gravity I think is a good thing, and it definitely makes things more engaging. As far as the buttons go, one button shoots rockets via the front of the Hawk Z, or drops bombs directly below depending on your orientation, and the other is used to change direction, allowing the helicopter to face left, right, or towards the screen. This might seem awkward at first, but it actually works extremely well, allowing the player to stay focused on a specific target while moving back and forth to avoid enemies and their weapons. In another stab at realism, the Hawk Z has inertia flying back and forth, meaning that if the helicopter is flying left, it's not just going to turn on a dime and go back to the right. You have to allow for a second or two to change direction. All control in the game feels very deliberate, and almost always, when deaths or other mishaps occur in game, you can't blame poor controls. However, that doesn't mean the game is easy. Oh, no. In fact, if you've never played the game before, it'll probably take you more than a few attempts to make it to the second level. Even myself, who was familiar with how the game worked, specifically the Commodore 64 version, needed a while to familiarize myself with this version and the layout of the first level. There's lots of things that can go wrong. As I mentioned earlier, you could accidentally fly too low, avoiding things, and crash into the ground. You could get caught trying to fly between rockets fired from SAMs, and they fire a lot of rockets. You could get hit by a tank or a jeep when trying to rescue soldiers. And on and on. Playing the game requires a significant amount of patience, and you certainly just can't blow through levels. My only real gripe when it comes to the control or poor design is where the Hawk X is sometimes located on the screen. Rather than constantly keeping you in the center of the screen or all the way to one side, frequently after changing direction, you will end up toward the side of the screen that's in the direction that you're traveling. What that means is you literally can't see what you're flying towards until you have flown a certain distance in that direction and the screen adjusts. It has to do with the pseudo 3D effect that the game goes on with the parallax scrolling, so I understand technically why it does it, but it's still aggravating, especially in a game with 1-hit kills. These sequences, which potentially lead to undodgeable attacks, are the only part of the game I would truly describe as actually unfair, rather than just difficult. All in all, Zilog and Moto is leaving 2019 with a bang and giving Choplifter 4 stars. Now, I know, that probably seems like a lot to give what's essentially a 3-level arcade shooter, and 3 stars is arguably more appropriate. But remember, it's a solid part of the arcade version that, depending on your viewpoint, is improved by removing the artificial gas time limit system. Its graphics closely resemble that arcade version, it controls well, and it's just hard enough to have an addictive quality that gets you to keep playing and try to set an even higher score. Also, had this game come out in 1988 or 1989, it probably would have only earned 3 stars. But remember, this is essentially a launch title, and for that, I think it's earned its place with that rarefied 4-star air.
Okay, so that was Choplifter for the Master System. I didn't plan this at all, but it's always nice to get surprised by a title that ends up to be really good. This is one of those games I got for the collection and for a long time just kind of looked at. I was like, oh yeah, that game. because I only remembered the Commodore 64 version and I wasn't familiar with the arcade release, and due to that, I wasn't ever really excited to try it out. But to get a good game to end the year with is especially nice, and gives me some hope to find some more diamonds in the rough in Season 2 next year. Tune in on New Year's for the Zilog and Moto Season 1 Year in Review, where I take a look back at the 47 games I reviewed this year, make a few best worst of lists, and hand out some awards. Also, take a look at the statistics for the year from YouTube and where I hope to get by the end of year 2020. Thanks to everyone who's watched, subscribed, and commented this year. I hope you've all enjoyed what you've seen, and there's more to come. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.